Good morning. It is 8:49 a.m. on Sunday, February 25th, 2018. I'm Christiana Ellis, and I just got up, more or less. This is 5 more minutes, and it is Sunday, so I'm doing the rewatch of Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex. If you were tuning in because you wanted to know what's going on with me and Luna, well, I am releasing 2 videos today. One covers that. This one is going to only be about the Ghost in the Shell rewatch. So if you want to know what's going on with that, you need to check out the other video that I posted today. So, Ghost in the Shell Standalone Complex, episode 16. And I am forgetting the name of it for a second because I did not pull up the episode summary ahead of time the way I usually do. And I'll have it in a moment. The title of the enemy was Chinks in the Armor of the Heart, AG20. AG20, I think, is probably going to be in a periodic table. I didn't look it up. AG20, though, is, let's see. AG is, of course, the abbreviation for silver, but it's not element 20, so I'm not actually 100% sure what that's a reference to. But in the meantime, this is a standalone episode. The only real connection to other episodes that it has are it follows through with the Tachikoma being sent to the lab and kind of covering in Ghost in the Shell's typical oblique way Batos' reaction to that. There's also a few minor connections in the sense that it refers to Aramaki going to London, for example, which is actually, I believe, the subject of the next episode. And so, in the meantime, we don't have so this episode is interesting because I think it's great character stuff for Bato. All of that emotional angle stuff really works well with the caveat that there are details of the plot that just make no sense at all. So the brief synopsis of the plot is that Bato is essentially told to go and bring this guy in, but Bato is observing, this is an athlete. A former athlete who was really successful, and I was a big fan, so it's a little weird to bring him in. And so then, as a part of kind of scoping him out and getting to know what his deal is, Bato sees that in many respects this guy has what Bato would consider a good life, but he seems dissatisfied by it. And so essentially they have this kind of connection where you sort of feel like if this guy wasn't a criminal and Bato wasn't a super cop and they had met in some other way, they could have been friends, maybe. But it's also not really that, because part of what makes Bato as angry as he is by the end of the episode is this feeling that this guy should be happier than he is. Bato thinks that this guy should be happier than he is, and he's mad that this guy doesn't appreciate what he has. That sort of thing. But it's also just complicated, and it's really meaty emotional material for Bato as a character who, in many episodes, is a little bit, I don't want to say one-dimensional, but, he's usually the guy who's a little bit glib, like he's making the wisecracks without necessarily letting anything penetrate. So, but let's talk in a little more detail about some of what's going on here. So first we have the Tachikoma, and they have tied various little ribbons around themselves and are singing a song as they are leaving the base to go back to the lab. And it's a song, I don't actually know the song, but it's a song about a girl being essentially sold to go to a foreign land, and it's kind of a sad song, and they're singing it in a sad way, and for them to choose to sing that all together in their little girl voices as they leave with all these weird ribbons indicates that they would be really, that maybe they're actually really sad about going back to the lab, But of course, when he asks them about it, they respond in their cheery way, like that's their sort of default tone of voice. And it further reinforces the idea that certainly we know they're sophisticated enough to have curiosity at the very least, but their emotional range is a little bit less clear. They certainly have demonstrated emotional responses to things, but they tend to always express everything in that still sort of bubbly, cheery sort of voice. And so we wonder, it's like, is it possible, like, so even though their voices sound happy when they're describing the nature of the song, oh yeah, of course we know what the song's about, and here's what it is, and so bye, I guess we're going back to the lab. Do they actually feel happy in the way their voice sounds, or is that just a factor of presentation? I don't know. Are they playing it up for Bato? It's hard to say, because it's hard to imagine. Well, but then again, it's like we have to think about, like, well, what does it mean that they chose to sing a song like that? Did they just think it was interesting that their situation had a superficial similarity, and so they thought that that would be fun? Or is it more meaningful than that? Hard to say, but certainly for Bato, who has an affection and an attachment to them and is not happy with them being sent to the lab, for him, for sure, it feels like a sad thing. And so, he's definitely grumpy about it. And there's actually a really nice subtle moment too, where one of the more, one of the less sophisticated AI robots, the ones that look just like just the simple, women with the ponytail. There's a moment that's kind of subtle. You could blink and miss it in the episode, but it's kind of interesting, where she comes in with a neutral expression with new orders for Bato, and there's just this moment of hesitation where it sees him with his feet up on the desk, kind of scowling and glowering, and then it takes a moment and its neutral expression just goes, and then it comes in with like a more happy, like upbeat, have new orders for you. And it's interesting just to see that it's a lot less sophisticated than the Tachikomas, but it has these programmed emotional responses designed to produce different, reactions in people that they're communicating with. So that's interesting, I think. But in any event, what we have here is, in this episode, I think there's maybe, you could make a minor complaint that there's a bit where it feels almost like what we're supposed to be seeing is a flashback, but then you only kind of gradually realize, oh wait, no, it's not a flashback, it's just, it's what's happening. Because Bato says that, oh yeah, I'm supposed to bring this guy in, but I was, kind of a fan of his. And so then it's, logical for us to conclude that we might then be seeing a flashback of how he became a fan, because we see this guy that Bato is targeting, training recruits apparently, in a sort of a fighting class, and Bato is kind of shadowing and hanging out and kind of gets involved to watch this guy. And so we could imagine that this is in the past and this is how they met. But what we discover later is, of course, that, it was just that Bato was a fan from afar of this guy's athletic prowess and his many trophies and tournaments and so on that he did, competed in as a fighter. But in any event, they have this, bonding through fist fighting thing that's common in macho guy circles, apparently, or at least in TV and movies. But apparently there's this whole thing like the prosthetic blind spot, which again is another one of the elements that kind of doesn't make a lot of sense. Like the stuff about them both having a prosthetic body, but they can still kind of be punched unconscious. I mean, it makes sense, I suppose, from a perspective that, even a cybernetic brain could theoretically take damage enough to, to shut down briefly or suspend function or something like that. And the prosthetic blind spot idea kind of could work into that. Like it's like, oh yeah, you can disrupt this sort of behavior, and it forces it into a temporary shutdown if you can hit it just like this or something like that. We can imagine that maybe being true, but then it's sort of like the payoff is only emotional and metaphorical in terms of the idea of this blind spot, because it turns out all along that Bato really only let himself lose. And it also kind of makes sense too that if there is such a thing as this prosthetic blind spot, that someone like Bato with the top of the line, cutting edge, bleeding edge prosthetic model working for Section 9 probably would know about something like that, and maybe engineer around it. So anyway, he basically pretends to not know, although we don't know that until the end. But meets this guy, forms this connection with him, and then continues to try to spy on him. Goes over to his house to kind of this promised follow-up conversation of like, oh, I'll tell you all about this prosthetic blind spot. And what we see from there is this guy, seeming, like friendly, but also we see a couple of things, like the wife brings in like this special family homemade drink, and the guy's mad because, oh no, you're supposed to bring the expensive stuff, you just don't understand, and he's just totally blowing her off. And it's so she seems really nice, and he's just really not appreciative of her trying to put extra thought into something instead of just bringing the most expensive thing by default. And so I think we initially have a little ping there of like, oh, that's not very cool of this guy. And then so Bato continues to follow him. What's he doing? Why is he bringing his boxing gloves to lunch? That sort of thing. And then what we see is that under the guise of bringing an autographed pair of boxing gloves to this place, he's actually stealing data for criminal purposes, presumably. They never really go into it. What we discover later too is that it was all kind of a setup, meaning they were trying to just figure out where he was sending it to, as opposed to so what he ended up getting was not what he thought he was getting. But at the same time, he's a little more sophisticated than they thought, because when Bato breaks into his office, he's able to detect it, and so there's a little bit of back and forth. Bato ends up trailing him. They have, I guess all that's after the scene in the bar where there's a little bit more of this discussion of, his past as an athlete and how he feels like, he has all of these first place trophies, and then one match where he didn't get first place, he only got second place. But he talks about how that match ruined his life because all the endorsements dried up, and basically we get the sense that he's just got this huge lingering bitterness and resentment about that. And it's not, first of all, clear why, like, well, what happened in that match, or is it just a fluke? But the point being, he is so stuck on this idea that he was supposed to have, continued that whole streak, and that this 1 second place just ruins everything and changes his whole life, and he can't appreciate what he has as a result. So, we can't, he's not appreciative of his wife. And we see, there's actually an interesting moment to just tie into this, too, that Bato lies to the guy's wife, saying he has his own wife and kid. And it's just kind of pings for us, too, there, just because we know that's not true. So it's like, oh, okay, well, I guess it's his cover story, but also, why that cover story? And there's some detail in there that, the cover story didn't necessarily need him to have a wife and kid, but... So, ultimately, what it comes down to is, we have this final confrontation, and here's one of the bits about how, the criminal investigation portion of this really makes no sense, because if the whole idea was this guy is stealing data We need to find out who he's stealing it for. And the idea is that we can set it up so that he gets only, garbage data, and we can trail him. Then why does Bato immediately shoot the other guy's dead and then only fight with this target guy, Zaitsev? Like, that doesn't really make sense, right? I mean, I suppose we could chalk it up to Bato having this emotional reaction that he's obviously having, although it still seems a little bit irresponsible even for him if that was really the goal. But the episode ultimately isn't interested in that. It's really only interested in Bato's kind of emotional relationship that he's made with this guy. And so they fight, and this guy is confident. It's like, oh, this blind spot you think that I have, and you're going to exploit it. Well, try it. Try it on me now. And this guy seems confident that he can do it, but it turns out Bato really didn't have the blind spot. He let himself lose before. And so the real blind spot, as this guy in a kind of melodramatic line after he is beaten, Zaitsev says, "It's me that has the blind spot in my heart." And that's, of course, ties into the title, Chinks in the armor of the heart. And this idea that he couldn't tell from Bato that Bato had lost. But what we know and understand, too, from Bato's perspective is that his other blind spot is his inability to recognize that he has a fine life. Just because it wasn't the one he originally planned, his resentment and his inability to appreciate what he has, because he thinks he should have had more. And the fact that he's blowing up that life that he does have with this criminal enterprise, Bato does not approve. And there's just to twist that emotional knife there, after taking him in, Bato's walking back by that bar, and this guy's wife is apparently just waiting outside, which is weird. I don't know what's going on there, unless it's just plot convenience. But in any event, she has more of this, special drink. It's, I guess, a kind of mead. She says it's made from honey. And honey wine of some kind. And so she offers it and says, I know you didn't especially care for it, but maybe give it to your wife. And, it just twists the knife of this, again, of Bato saying, this woman is so nice. She doesn't deserve what this guy has done to their lives, and she doesn't even know it yet. And she's just offered me, to get a gift for my wife who isn't real, because I don't actually have a wife, because the life I have doesn't really allow for that. Although, we could take a step back and say, well, maybe it could. Togusa has a family. So, but in any event, it's hard because Bato knows that he doesn't actually have a wife to give it to. And then he goes back to base, and he's looking in his locker, and he has this bottle, and he also has all of these cans of the natural oil that he was giving his Tachikoma. I don't know if we're meant to assume that he continued giving it to them even after he was ordered not to, or if it was just left over from that. But certainly it's a reminder of the Tachikoma's leaving and another sense of loss. And so he is not taking it well. He kind of, smashes the bottle and tries to throw away the oil. And the episode closes on, punching bag, just trying to work out his anger at this guy. And then, of course, the end of the episode, we have, it's like the little Tachikoma Club mini cartoons. Well, the Tachikoma have left, so no more of those, I guess. That's the implication. And so next we'll have the adventures of CEO Jameson, that guy who speaks in the faux Texas accent and wears that little robot around. So we'll see. And so anyway, the next episode will be episode 17, The True Reason for the Unfinished Love Affair, Angel's Share, which, as I mentioned, seems to be the one where Aramaki has gone to London. And we follow that. So, I will leave it there. I'm not sure this coming Sunday. I'm thinking we'll probably not have the rewatch. I might do it later in that week. But in the meantime, I'll talk to you tomorrow for 5 more minutes.